Hello, BookTube. This is Mike Frost, the postmodern poetry prognosticator, here with my second installment of my August in Africa Friday reads. This week, I concentrated mostly on the Chinua Achebe's works, both poetry and novel and his essays. But before I get started, I want to point out that one of the dangers of reading one author for a week in this effort to educate myself on African literature is the idea that I can think of it one-dimensional, that there's not a whole lot of variety to African literature, which could not be any further from the truth. The month-long exposure that I'm having here has really convinced me of how diverse the writing is coming out of the continent, as one would expect. So even before I begin, I want to dispel any kind of idea, because I'm going to talk about Chinua Achebe primarily, but there's a diversity of writings that I want to talk about. And when I get to the chapbooks that I've read this week, maybe that idea comes out a little bit better. But we'll start with the essays, Home and Exile, that Chinua Achebe wrote. These are 3 essays in this book. He covers his experience as a child in classes in a school where he's exposed to Western literature. And the Western literatures that he's exposed to as an African child in an colonized African country is things like Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. And, another one he mentions is Mr. Johnson, one I have not read, Mr. Johnson by Joyce Carey. These are works written by the colonizing country, the authors from the colonizing countries, that really distort what Africans are, Africa is. It's a really distorted view, mainly written with the idea of self-justification for the colonizing of these countries, for the enslavement of people, saying that it's okay to enslave them because they don't really have any culture anyway. It's okay to dominate them and to bring them culture because they have none of their own. I think Rudyard Kipling was the one that said it was the white man's burden to civilize the world. Such things as the height of arrogance. I don't think you can put it any other way. It's the height of arrogance to think that it's okay to colonize a country or a people because you're bringing them civilization, or to update that term, or bring them democracy. It's the height of arrogance. So as a child being exposed to these kind of literatures, he wanted to, as a lot of African writers do, and I don't want to make this sound pompous or anything, but the idea that they want to write the misconception of who Africans are, what African history is, what the African continent is, to correct those misconceptions is one of the reasons why he started writing. And I think that's probably true of many of these post-colonial writers that are trying to write to really, because of the distorted view they were raised with, they were like, wait, no, that's not right. Let me tell you the real story. So they write for that idea in mind. I hope that doesn't come across as pompous, because that's not the way it comes across in his essays or in his books. The essays are great. Really gives you a good history. Now, for me, because I expand the definition of colonial writing. So for me, not what's in this essay, but for me, I also include, like in America, slave narratives, because they were written during the time of colonization. So these slave narratives, although they're not written by the colonists, they're written by the slaves, and as the term slave narrative would indicate, because it's written at that time, it's also a dimension of that idea of colonized writing. And then there are some writers that write in imitation of those that colonized. If you take a look at the very early American writers, before we became the United States, a lot of our writings is imitating the writers of Great Britain, trying to be more British than the British in some of their writings. That's a colonizing idea. You can argue whether it's good, bad writing, but the mindset is to outright the colonizers in the way that they write. It's a dimension of it. So there's a lot of these dimensions that are not brought across in these essays that I personally consider in the colonial period of writing. Maybe one day I'll do a video just on what I call, because I think I express in these videos the idea of modern, postmodern, and post-postmodern writing. and the diversity that's coming out of postmodern writing. But there's also colonial, post-colonial, and what I would indicate as post-colonial writing. And there's differences between those two. So maybe a different video, a different time. I'm trying to work for brevity on these things. So the other book that I read was Things Fall Apart. This was a reread for me. And I reread it in the light of some of the things that I'm discovering in these essays. So the first time I read it, the main character of this book is a tragic hero in the Greek tragic sense of a strong character with a fatal flaw. And his fatal flaw ends up costing him, and it's reflected in also his society, his tribe in this case. And I read it that way the first time years and years ago when I read it. I looked at it as a main character with that tragic fatal flaw, if you will. And this time I read it with the idea of the very last part of the book where the colonizers come in and how that affects it. And it has a great deal to do with the fatal flaw actually working itself. I don't want to spoil it for anybody that hasn't read this book, but if you haven't read it, you got to read it. I mean, this is a classic. So I would highly recommend you read this book and take it from both just the story aspect of it, which is, if I can use the term Greek tragedy, that tragic hero that is a strong personality with a fatal flaw, but also as the beginning parts of the colonizing of Africa. What that is, you have to get to the very latter part of the book to get to that. The first part of the book is not that, but it does add to the dimension of this book. It adds depth and layers to this book, especially when you consider what his objectives were when you read his essays in writing this book and books like it. So those extra layers, I think in any good book that stands up to rereading, no matter how many times you read it, you find things in it, you discover things in it, and because you have matured, your reading has matured, you see more in it. And that is the case in this book for me, in rereading it in light of some of the things that I've discovered since then. It's been years, discovered since then. And then what I'm really concentrating and trying to expand my thinking on in this particular month, this has taken on new dimensions for me. So if you've not read this book, please read this book. It's a classic. The last thing on Chinua Achebe's book list for me this week was his poetry. And given that I'm a fan of his writings, both the nonfiction and the fiction, I wasn't as enamored as I'd hoped with his poetry. I'll be perfectly honest with you. Not bad poetry. I will read this again, but I wasn't struck as I had hoped to be by his poetry. He's definitely a prose writer. But there are good poems in here. Lazarus was a good poem, good use of humor in the poem Lazarus. Those Gods Are Children was a good poem. Their Idiot Song was another really good poem. Nice music. But as I was reading this, it wasn't really and then I came across one poem that will stay with me for the rest of my life. There are some poems that I have read in my life that I think are, if I can use this word, perfect. Just going off the top of my head, Yeats's Later in the Swan, his Second Coming, Robert Frost's Mending Wall. There's some works that are just the word, every single word, every single image compacted is executed perfectly. And you don't run across those kind of, I read a lot of poetry and I just like to spend time in a poet's world, in a poet's mind. So it's not about finding, one of those poems that are going to live with you forever. That's not my objective in reading poetry. I just like to spend time with it and really enjoy all the aspects that I kind of find in poetry. I'm a poetry nerd, I be honest with you. But when you run across one of those poems, and it's entitled A Mother in a Refugee Camp. And in amongst all these, decent poems, good poems, some of them, I get this poem and it just wowed me. So let me share this one with you. and I hope I can get it across as well as it is written. A mother in a refugee camp. No Madonna and child could touch her tenderness for a son she soon would have to forget. The air was heavy with odors of diarrhea, of unwashed children with washed out ribs and dried up bottoms waddling in labored steps behind blown empty bellies. Other mothers there had long ceased to care, but not this one. She held a ghost smile between her teeth, and in her eyes the memory of a mother's pride. She had bathed him and rubbed him down with bare palms. She took from their bundle of possessions a broken comb and combed the rust-colored hair left on his skull. And then, humming in her eyes, began carefully to part it. In their former life, this was perhaps a little daily act of no consequence before breakfast and school. Now she did it like putting flowers on a tiny grave. There are a few poems that I read in my life that I know will stay with me for the rest of my life. And that was one of them. I will not be forgetting that poem. Okay, so from there, of course, every morning I was reading a different chapbook. I'm using the box actually to hold up my camera, so I can't show you the box. But the box set from the, let me see if I can find the New Generation African Poets, a chapbook box set. I don't see a picture of the whole box set, but this is I finished up the 2019 box set that my sister was so kind and generous to buy me for this read-a-thon. And I read a number of them this week, and here I'm going to try to express some of the diversity. I'm trying to work on brevity here, but I'm going to try to work on some of the diversity of these things. So the first one is Inside the Flower Room. This is by Saddiq, Dzukogi. I'm sorry if I'm butchering these names. From Zaire. I think he's living in Nigeria now. And for this one, okay, so some poems I get, some poems I don't. And this one, I'm not sure I got really where he was going with a lot of these poems. So I would really like to hear other people that read these poems and tell me what you think. There was just a few of them that just, some odd word choices really messed me up in reading them. Just to give you an idea of where I'm going with it. One that's called The Pigeon. The Pigeon, the title is also part of that first line. You gotta read it as part of the first line. The pigeon sees Baja's future cleavage. I don't need to wonder what's on its mind. She is 5 months old. Everything's still forming. An unfolding leaf at the edge of a cracked earth where only a pigeon knows pebble from seed. Lying on my lap, my hand is a world where I love to wash my child. The bathtub accommodates the daughter. It goes on like that. But that word cleavage, speaking of a child that's young enough to be bathed by the father, gave me an odd kind of, I didn't get the word choice. And I'm using that as one example, but there are a lot of the things that I just didn't get in the word choice. Now there was some poems that I did enjoy. It wasn't, there was another chapbook that I talked about last week that I didn't get any of the poems. In this one I did get several of the poems, and some of them were good. There was just enough of them with an odd word choice that kind of threw me off. I couldn't get into the whole of the poems based on it, and just enough of them to throw me off. There was enough of them that were good, though, that were like Come Inside. The opening poem was very good. Flower Room was good. There was Flower Room on a personal level. It was just kind of, I'll read the first couple lines. I looked at her and discovered grandmother lives inside fruit, fresh off the tree. A body maps its own origin, rifles for the familiar place, self-portrait of a father in a little girl's eyes. I remember when my daughter Eden was born, we couldn't figure out who she looked like. She didn't look like her mother or me, and we were stumped to figure out who she looked like. It was like right on the, it's one of those like, I know, but I can't place it, I can't figure it out. And we were stumped for a while, several days, when we just kept looking at the child and wondering, who does she look like? My mother, who sews, I had sewn her a onesie, just in a floral thing, very floral, that is very much my mother. And while we were still in the hospital, I put it on her. We were going to take some pictures with it. And immediately upon putting it on, we realized that her eyes, my daughter's, Eden's eyes, were my mother's eyes. I mean, exactly, a gray, beautiful setup. I mean, just gorgeous eyes. And when we put on the onesie and saw the floral pattern, it was very much my mother. My wife and I both spontaneously said, "That's your mother, that's my mother." Immediately recognized who she looked like. Maybe not all the features, but her eyes were just my mother's eyes. And it was stunning. So on a personal level, this poem kind of struck me. I don't know why, but I went back to that. So this one, overall, there was some good ones. There were some ones I just didn't get, and word choices kind of threw me off. So I would love to hear anybody else's opinions on this. Maybe some of the word choices that struck you as odd, or maybe it's just me. Every reader is different. I certainly don't want to say that I'm the arbiter of taste on any of these sort of things. And I really do like to engage in the comments section. I had somebody, I'm going to take this out of this particular read-a-thon, I had somebody make a remark on a completely different video that I would. The video was one of the, I think it was Erica Jung's Fear of Flying video, in which I said it was a really good work, and compared it to like 50 Shades of Grey, which I didn't like. And this person disagreed with me, saying that Erica Jung's Fear of Flying was, I can't remember the exact words, but trash novel that started this idea of, it, broke up the nuclear family. It was the disintegration. It was okay to divorce for whatever reasons. And that's an arguable position. I would disagree with it, but it's an arguable position. I mean, that's something that if you're, now I'm not saying this person is a conservative or anything else, but he made the comparisons between what a progressive and a conservative would read into that kind of story. And I'm not making any judgments there. Love that this person, and I don't know if it's male or female, engaged with me in the comment section. And I would love to hear those kind of comments that, even if you disagree with me, I found no redeeming quality in 50 Shades of Grey. My wife liked the book. I did not. I didn't. Erica Jung's book, to me, is a far better work. I mean, I don't even think it's in the same category. But to argue that a book was, and a feminist book was something that helped destroy the nuclear family, is an argument I would completely disagree with, but worthy of engagement with, worthy of discussion, and a viable or an arguable point of view, even if I disagree with it. If you try to argue with me that slavery was good or colonization was good, then morally you have no grounds to stand on. So I'm not going to engage you in that kind of conversation. But a conversation over a poet's choice of words, a poet's choice of images, I would love to engage you in the comment section. Moving on. Okay. Leila Chatti. Oh, did I love spending time with Leila in this book. She's a Tunisian-American poet. This is not what I would call a political work or anything like that. This was, I'll read just this little part about from the introduction from here. She's talking about the tone of her poems. It says, if there is one word that captures the tone of these lithe and sonorous poems, it is a Portuguese term, and I don't know how to pronounce this, saudade. Although broadly considered untranslatable, it is proximate to melancholy, nostalgia, a sense of longing and loss for a lover, a situation, or a place. Yet as a poetic construct, it is only partially elegiac. It also describes an active, a presence of the absence itself. I've never heard of that word before, but I love it. And these poems, just the tone of these poems and the wording, the use of lines, everything. It was just, it was really nice to spend time in this book. This book I would recommend. It's not going to give you one of those, like the Chinua Achebe's post-colonial reactions to the colonists. This is more of a personal level stuff. But man, what a really beautifully written and tonetically perfect work. Really look forward to reading more from her. That was a really lovely morning to be able to sit down and spend some time with Leila, I believe is the way you would pronounce her name. Really, really nice. This book, Xamissa, I believe is the way you pronounce that. The Water Archives. Henk, Rossouw. I'm butchering these names. I know I'm butchering these names. A South African writer. Cape Town, I guess, is the new name for the city that was called Xamissa. I'm going to say Xamissa. And this, so he's originally from South Africa. I guess he's right now at the University of Houston. And so we talked a little bit about the colonial, post-colonial, post-colonial styles of writing, or not. Well, I guess we haven't really talked about the styles, but this struck me as it's thematically post-colonial and stylistically postmodern. Postmodern, for put this in a nutshell, I'm really doing it a disservice, is a mixture of both the modern techniques and the postmodern, but the ideas go beyond it. Stylistically, it's a mixture of those modern and postmodern styles, but the ideas are not modern or postmodern. All right, it would take a long video to go through that, but maybe in the future I'll do a video on that. But this, because it's the poems are so long and so intricate, I can't really do them justice by quoting them. But he goes, it's stylistically, one of the things that just jumped out at me is he uses a lot of incomplete sentences. And I don't mean that in a negative way. It was a very positive way. So the sentence would like just stop. And sometimes, because a lot of this work is about the erasure of history, he'd be talking about something and it would just end. And you realize what he's doing is stylistically imitating the idea that the history has been erased from that point on. And that stylistic choice, I just thought it was tremendous use of an incomplete sentence. It's also, it's often used sometimes to indicate a premature end of a conversation or a movement. And then sometimes it's used to express the idea that this present is not really, there's no clear future. So it just kind of ends at the present, but there's no idea of where we're going to go from here. So stylistic, that use of the incomplete sentence, you would just be, and it would just stop at of, or something along those lines, like preposition, and just stop. No object to the preposition, no adjectives after the preposition, just nothing, and it would just stop, and you'd be like, what? But then you get it. It's just stylistically beautiful. So there's a mixture here, I think, of modern and postmodern, and stylistically it becomes postmodern. But thematically, it's still talking about a lot of the experiences of Cape Town, historically speaking, and how history is erased. It talks a little bit about the slave museum there, and it beautifully rendered there. So yeah, I was really happy with this book. This one I'm going to I've got it in my pile to read again and kind of keep going through, both for its stylistic aspects and for its theme. So this is going on my ever-increasing pile of these chapbooks that are going to be read and reread again and again. So yeah, if you get that one, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that one. The Origins of Butterflies, Romeo Oriogun. Here we're talking about diversity. Now this is one aspect of diversity that I'll share with you, but this is a gay writer talking about the gay experience in, I don't want to name a particular place because then it does a disservice to every place else. So the things that I got across in this thing is just all right, so we talked about colonialism as a structure that goes in and colonizes an entire people. But when I talked about the feminism video, I also talked about the colonial experience is really a dominating culture, dominating another culture or another people's. And it's the same trauma and the same post-structural or post-traumatic stress disorder kind of issues come up when I talk about feminism, because women in general have been dominated by males in a lot of history, not universally, not always, but in a lot of our history. And the movements of feminism, you can track that right along the same scale and same process as a colonized people. And the LGBTQ plus community, you can do the same thing. It's a dominated culture and forced to fall within certain parameters by the dominant culture, oppressed. All of these words you can use for both the general people, like many of the Africans put into slavery in Central, South, Caribbean, North America. You can talk about the same thing with feminists and the same thing with the LGBTQ plus community. So this is, I would love to be able to do, this is fabulous, and snap my fingers or however, I think it would come off very badly for me. Openly gay, celebrating who he is in a society where, he talks a little bit about when the Christians came in, and of course under the colonials rule, homosexuals did not fare very well at all. I really don't know, and I haven't really read enough about the Africa before colonization, how homosexuals were treated. Was it much along the lines of, say, Native Americans, which had no issues with it? It wasn't something you died or got killed for. And I suppose with a continent as large as Africa, it'd probably be different in different areas of Africa. But this was a really nice group of poems to spend some time with. Enjoyed the point of view, opened up your mind to some of the things. And this is a. All right, I'm going to read a little bit of Departure, one of the poems at the beginning of this thing. And you get the sense of who you're talking to when you're talking to this gentleman here, Romeo, I'll just call him because I can pronounce that word, that name. So at the end of the poem, the last stanza, and I'm in a bus station, saying goodbye to boys searching for cities where they can hold hands and walk on beaches and know that what it means to live here. And I know what it means to live here, with words invented for hate, with wounds asked to be silent. And when they leave, I want to whisper into ears filled with dunes of the desert, do not forget I still live here. So it captures kind of the different reactions to the oppression. Some people try to go off to maybe they can find paradise somewhere where they can walk on the beaches and hold hands and be openly gay. I'm sure there are places like that in Africa, as there are places in this world. And then there's others that stay right there and say, I'm going to change here. It's not accepting now. It's not what we'd hope it would be now. But this is where I am, and it's going to be different because I'm going to make it different. that kind of attitude, that fabulous attitude, is throughout these. The Origins of Butterflies. Really great group of poems, stir you. Last one I've got here, I think there was one other chapbook, but I don't think I brought it out here, but I think I'm missing one. But anyway, No Home in This Land, Rasaq Malik, from Nigeria. Yeah. So this, another one that I did enjoy. All right, so we talked a little bit about the use of line enjambments and some sentences. Here, he uses the long line to great effect. The sweepingness of this. I think in the preface they talk about Whitman and the long lines, but I got a sense more of the Allen Ginsberg kind of feel out of that. Not really good poetry, really thought-provoking, and just sweeping in its scope. I don't know if I can put it any other way without getting into reading a bunch of these poems, but really, really enjoyed this poetry here from Rasaq Malik, I think is the way you pronounce his name. We Don't Know Where We Belong is a good poem here. We do not know where we belong because home is no longer a tender skin of an infant, a coal in the face of a bride, the smooth texture of the stone beneath a sea, and incredible memories of a lover's touch, the pristine laughter of a child enveloped in a mother's arms, the peace we seek as we wake up. Every day we hear gunfire in the air. We see ambulances racing in the scenes of bomb blasts, police cars swarming the streets like insects lured by the magic of light. We do not know where we belong because Borno, everybody knows how to narrate the grim stories of war, how to describe the head of a man blown by bombs, how to pick the fragments of broken walls, how to grieve whenever war disperses people to refugee camps, how to mourn the young bashed by rifles, carted as spoils of wars, how to survive the repetitive sounds of grenades, how to outlive the thick fragrance of smoke, how to pray with tears gathered in our eyes. There is no home in this country because war is the only song we hear whenever people hide underneath the cupboards, in their bathrooms, under the beds. There is no home here in this country because whether we die or comes or not, my children will still ask me when will we leave this country? When will we pack our luggage and say, thank you, city of smoke and bones? So I hope that gives you an idea. One of the things I really loved was that there's not often I like the word is or of or some of these other words at the end of a line, but that third stanza when he says, there is no home in this country because war is, in jabbed, the only song we hear whenever people hide. Now, when reading it, you should read right past that enjambment. There is no home in this country because war is the only song we hear whenever people hide in the cupboards, because it's a long sweeping line. But if you stop and pay attention and you read it just as one line, there is no home in this country because war is. As a single line, that's just stunning. Okay, so I'm back. I'm a poetry nerd, people. I love that kind of stuff. But this book, okay, so I gravitate toward political type poems, and this book is just chock full of them. This is a guy that's gone to a war-torn area, and he writes primarily about the war-torn area. So if I gravitate toward a particular type of poetry, this is it. So I have a kind of a preconceived or prejudice in favor of this type of poetry. So I don't want to go gushing on because there's other types of poetry, and I want to give the diversity of this. But his long lines that if you want Whitman-esque type line is used to perfect effect in this. And Whitman wrote some more poems that this is reminiscent of. But this is certainly post-colonial in its outlook. But this is going right there in that pile of poems that I will read over and over again. I'm going to go back and back to Malik's poetry, and I eagerly anticipate this poet putting out a full-length collection besides a chapbook.